The Kremlin is a fortified complex in the center of Moscow founded by the Rurik dynasty. It is the best known of the Kremlins, and includes 5 palaces, 4 cathedrals, and the enclosing Kremlin wall with Kremlin towers. In addition, within this complex is the Grand Kremlin Palace that was formerly the Tsar's Moscow residence. The complex now serves as the official residence of the President of the Russian Federation and as a museum with almost 3 million visitors in 2017. The Kremlin overlooks the Moskva River to the south, St. Basil's Cathedral and Red Square to the east, and the Alexander Garden to the west. The name Kremlin means fortress inside a city, and is often also used metonymically to refer to the government of the Russian Federation. It previously referred to the government of the Soviet Union and its highest members. The term Kremlinology refers to the study of Soviet and Russian politics. The Kremlin is open to the public and offers individual and group guided tours. Visible are the armory chamber, Tsar cannon, Tsar bell, artillery pieces, and the exposition of Russian wooden sculpture and carvings. History. Origin. The site had been continuously inhabited by Finnic peoples since the 2nd century BC. The East Slavs occupied the southwestern portion of Borovitsky Hill as early as the 11th century, as evidenced by a metropolitan seal from the 1090s which was unearthed by Soviet archaeologists in the area. The Vyatiki built a fortified structure on the hill where the Neglinaya River flowed into the Moskva River. Up to the 14th century, the site was known as the Grad of Moscow. The word Kremlin was first recorded in 1331. The grad was greatly extended by Prince Yuri Dolgoruki in 1156, destroyed by the Mongols in 1237 and rebuilt in oak in 1339. Seat of Grand Dukes. Dmitry Donskoy replaced the oak walls with a strong citadel of white limestone in 1366–1368 on the basic foundations of the current walls. This fortification withstood a siege by Khan Tokhtamysh. Dmitry's son Vasily I resumed construction of churches and cloisters in the Kremlin. The newly built Cathedral of the Annunciation was painted by Theophans the Greek, Andrei Rublev, and Prokhor in 1406. The Chudov Monastery was founded by Dmitry's tutor, Metropolitan Alexis, while his widow, Eudoxia, established the Ascension Convent in 1397. Residence of the Tsars. The Golden Hall, a throne room with murals painted probably after 1547, was destroyed to make place for the Kremlin Palace, commissioned by Elizabeth of Russia and designed by architect Francesco Bartolomeo Rastrelli in 1752. Grand Prince Ivan III organized the reconstruction of the Kremlin, inviting a number of skilled architects from Renaissance Italy, including Petrus Antonius Solarius, who designed the new Kremlin wall and its towers, and Marcus Rufus who designed the new palace for the prince. It was during his reign that 3 extant cathedrals of the Kremlin, the Deposition Church, and the Palace of Facets were constructed. The highest building of the city in Muscovite Russia was the Ivan the Great Bell Tower, built in 1505–08 and augmented to its present height in 1600. The Kremlin walls as they now appear were built between 1485 and 1495. Spassky gates of the wall still bear a dedication in Latin praising Petrus Antonius Solarius for the design. After construction of the new Kremlin walls and churches was complete, the monarch decreed that no structures should be built in the immediate vicinity of the citadel. The Kremlin was separated from the walled merchant town by a 30-meter wide moat, over which St. Basil's Cathedral was constructed during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. The same Tsar also renovated some of his grandfather's palaces, added a new palace and cathedral for his sons, and endowed the Trinity Metacheion inside the Kremlin. The Metacheion was administrated by the Trinity Monastery, and contained the graceful tower church of St. Sergius, which was described by foreigners as one of the finest in the country. During the time of troubles, the Kremlin was held by the Polish forces for 2 years, between September 21, 1610 and October 26, 1612. The Kremlin's liberation by the volunteer army of Prince Dmitry Pozersky and Kuzma Minin paved the way for the election of Mikhail Romanov as the new Tsar. During his reign and that of his son Alexis and grandson Feofor, the 11-domed Upper Savior Cathedral, Armorial Gate, Tarim Palace, Amusement Palace, and the Palace of Patriarch Nikin were built. Following the death of Alexis's son, Feofor, and the Moscow uprising of 1682, Tsar Peter escaped with much difficulty from the Kremlin and as a result developed a dislike for it. 3 decades later, Peter abandoned the residence of his forefathers for his new capital, St. Petersburg. Imperial period. Although still used for coronation ceremonies, the Kremlin was abandoned and neglected until 1773, when Catherine the Great engaged Vasily Bachanov to build her new residence there. Bachanov produced a bombastic neoclassical design on a heroic scale, which involved the demolition of several churches and palaces, as well as a portion of the Kremlin wall. After the preparations were over, construction was delayed due to lack of funds. Several years later the architect Matvey Kozakov supervised the reconstruction of the dismantled sections of the wall and of some structures of the Chudov Monastery, and built the spacious and luxurious offices of the Senate, since adapted for use as the principal workplace of the President of Russia. During the imperial period, from the early 18th and until the late 19th century, the Kremlin walls were traditionally painted white, in accordance with fashion. French forces occupied the Kremlin from September 2 to October 11, 1812, following the French invasion of Russia. When Napoleon retreated from Moscow, he ordered the whole Kremlin to be blown up. The Kremlin arsenal, several portions of the Kremlin wall and several wall towers were destroyed by explosions and the faceted chamber and other churches were damaged by fire. Explosions continued for 3 days, from 21 to October 23, 1812. However, rain damaged the fuses, and the damage was less severe than intended. Restoration works were undertaken in 1816–1819, supervised by Osip Bov. During the remainder of the reign of Alexander I, several ancient structures were renovated in a fanciful neo-Gothic style, but many others, including all the buildings of the Trinity Medikaion, were condemned as disused or dilapidated and were torn down. On visiting Moscow for his coronation festivities, Tsar Nicholas I was not satisfied with the Grand Palace, which had been erected in the 1750s to the design of Francesco Rastrelli. The elaborate Baroque structure was demolished, as was the nearby Church of St. John the Precursor, built by Aloisio the New in 1508 in place of the first church constructed in Moscow. The architect Konstantin Thon was commissioned to replace them with the Grand Kremlin Palace, which was to rival the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg in its dimensions and in the opulence of its interiors. The palace was constructed in 1839–1849, followed by the rebuilding of the Kremlin Armory in 1851. After 1851 the Kremlin changed little until the Russian Revolution of 1917. The only new features added during this period were the monument to Alexander II and a stone cross marking the spot where in 1905 Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia was assassinated by Ivan Kaliev. These monuments were destroyed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. Soviet period and beyond. The Soviet government moved from Petrograd to Moscow on March 12, 1918. Vladimir Lenin selected the Kremlin Senate as his residence. Joseph Stalin also had his personal rooms in the Kremlin. He was eager to remove all the relics of the Tsarist regime from his headquarters. Golden eagles on the towers were replaced by shining Kremlin stars, while the wall near Lenin's mausoleum was turned into the Kremlin Wall necropolis. The Chudov Monastery and Ascension Convent, with their 16th-century cathedrals, were dismantled to make room for the military school. The Little Nicholas Palace and the Old Saviour Cathedral were pulled down as well. During the Second World War, in order to confuse the German pilots, the towers were repainted with different colors and covered with wooden tents. Every roof was painted rusty brown so as to make them indistinguishable from typical roofs in the city. The grounds, paved with cobblestone, were covered up with sand. Tents painted to look like roofs were stretched over the gardens, and the facades of the buildings were also painted. The residence of the Soviet government was closed to tourists until 1955. It was not until the Khrushchev thaw that the Kremlin was reopened to foreign visitors. The Kremlin museums were established in 1961, and the complex was among the first Soviet patrimonies inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1990. Although the current director of the Kremlin Museums, Elena Gagarina, advocates a full-scale restoration of the destroyed cloisters, recent developments have been confined to expensive restoration of the original interiors of the Grand Kremlin Palace, which were altered during Stalin's rule. State Kremlin Palace. Buildings. The existing Kremlin walls and towers were built by Italian masters from 1485 to 1495. The irregular triangle of the Kremlin wall encloses an area of 275,000 square meters. Its overall length is 2,235 meters, but the height ranges from 5 to 19 meters, depending on the terrain. The wall's thickness is between 3.5 and 6.5 meters. Originally there were 18 Kremlin towers, but their number increased to 20 in the 17th century. All but 3 of the towers are square in plan. The highest tower is the Troitskia, which was built to its present height of 80 meters in 1495. Most towers were originally crowned with wooden tents. The extant brick tents with strips of colored tiles date to the 1680s. Cathedral Square is the heart of the Kremlin. It is surrounded by 6 buildings, including 3 cathedrals. The Cathedral of the Dormition was completed in 1479 to be the main church of Moscow and where all the tsars were crowned. The massive limestone facade, capped with its 5 golden cupolas, was the design of Aristotele Fioravanti. Several important metropolitans and patriarchs are buried there, including Peter and Maccarii. The gilded, 3-domed Cathedral of the Annunciation was completed next in 1489, only to be reconstructed to a 9-domed design a century later. On the southeast of the square is the much larger Cathedral of the Archangel Michael, where almost all the Muscovite monarchs from Ivan Khalida to Ivan V of Russia are interred. There are 2 domestic churches of the Metropolitans and Patriarchs of Moscow, the Church of the 12 Apostles and the exquisite 1-domed Church of the Deposition of the Virgin's Robe, built by Pskov artisans from 1484 to 1488 and featuring superb icons and frescoes from 1627 and 1644. The other notable structure is the Ivan the Great Bell Tower on the northeast corner of the square, which is said to mark the exact center of Moscow and resemble a burning candle. Completed in 1600, it is 81 meters high. Until the Russian Revolution, it was the tallest structure in the city, as construction of buildings taller than that was forbidden. Its 21 bells would sound the alarm if any enemy was approaching. The upper part of the structure was destroyed by the French during the Napoleonic invasion and has been rebuilt. The Tsar Bell, the largest bell in the world, stands on a pedestal next to the tower. The oldest secular structure still standing is Ivan III's Palace of Facets, which holds the imperial thrones. The next oldest is the first home of the royal family, the Tarim Palace. The original Tarim Palace was also commissioned by Ivan III, but most of the existing palace was built in the 17th century. The Tarim Palace and the Palace of Facets are linked by the Grand Kremlin Palace. This was commissioned by Nicholas I in 1838. The largest structure in the Kremlin, it cost 11 million rubles to build and more than $1 billion to renovate in the 1990s. It contains dazzling reception halls, a ceremonial red staircase, private apartments of the Tsars, and the lower story of the Resurrection of Lazarus Church, which is the oldest extant structure in the Kremlin and the whole of Moscow. The northern corner of the Kremlin is occupied by the arsenal, which was built for Peter the Great in 1701. The southwestern section of the Kremlin holds the Armory building. Built in 1851 to a Renaissance Revival design, it is currently a museum housing Russian state regalia and diamond fund. The haloalkylophilic methylotrophic bacterium Methylophaga muralis was first isolated from deteriorating marble in the Kremlin. Helipad. To stop disruptions to traffic caused by motorcades, Russian President Vladimir Putin authorized the construction of a helipad in the Kremlin. The helipad was completed in May 2013. The Russian president will now commute back and forth to the Kremlin using a Mi-8 helicopter. Careful consideration was taken in choosing the location of the helipad. The location chosen is said to be of no threat to the architecture of the Kremlin. Moscow Metro. The nearest Moscow metro stations to the Kremlin are Okhotny Ryad and Biblioteka imeni Lenina, Teatrolnaya, Ploshchad Revolyutsii, Arbatskaya, Alexandrovsky Sad, and Borovitskaya.